Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There is more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 37,460 people from 160 countries, and it is supported by 518 organizations. We have many volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent, engaged in defending women's rights. Please join us. You can also become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. Please get in touch with us at info@womensdeclaration.com or via your country contact on the website womensdeclaration.com at the section Country Info. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers. We will have Sue England. She's a British lawyer living in Germany. And she will tell us what is the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women. Its acronym is CEDAW, that was approved by the UN in 1980. We also will have Eva Gastañaga from Peru, and she will tell us about prostitution in Peru. She will bring us an objective analysis of the problem of prostitution, reviewing the two positions that exist on it, and finally breaking down the problematic background of this practice in Peru. And last but not least, we will have Kalvig from Norway. She will give a talk titled Gender, Faith and Norway, the world's most equal country. In this talk, she will outline how Norway has the most extreme gender legislation in the world and how it affects our society, what has happened to women, children, and vulnerable groups of people, as well as academia and all institutions, administrations, and political parties in this ideological and also quite religious-like situation. Who are responsible, who are opposing the current craze, and how they are met. We will introduce Sue England. She's a lawyer that specializes in human rights law. Sue has lived and worked in several countries, including the UK, Belgium, and Germany. And to help ensure that women understand the rights, Sue does courses on human rights law for non-lawyers, which are very helpful and very much appreciated for many women. So thank you, Sue, for that. And over to you.
So I was here last week as well for another short presentation, and then I was actually doing the UK Human Rights Act. But now I'm going global because we're going to talk about a UN Human Rights Convention called CEDAW. And I will spend 10-15 minutes just going through the basics, which I think, for some people will be a refresher and other people will be something new for them. But it's all important and interesting. My human rights training sessions will be starting again sometime in this spring, but I'll send around the information to that about everybody, but I don't have a date at the moment. So let's look at CEDAW, as it's always called, CEDAW. And it's called that because it has a very, very long name, which nobody, can bother to read out most of the time. But it's a human rights convention that the UN did in 1980. And it's called the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women. So what is that? That's about 10 different words. But anyway, boiling down to CEDAW. And so this is from the UN. And the UN started making human rights conventions immediately after the Second World War. The one that everybody's heard of was the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. And then they moved on to other areas. And it took until 1980 to get round to look at women specifically. Obviously, the earlier conventions were supposed to cover all human beings. They're called human rights because you have them because you're a human. But they began to look at specific areas. And in 1980, it was women. In 1990, it was children. Later on, for example, there's another convention about disability, but we'll just focus on the women's one. So this is where, in the 1970s, political action, women working for women were pushing the UN to look at all the issues that concerned women and produce a new human rights convention. It's built around discrimination. And discrimination works in human rights field by saying you shouldn't be discriminated against compared to others. So obviously in this case, this is, as women, you shouldn't be treated worse than men. They are the comparator group, and that reflects the reality of the world that we live in. There are two sexes, and traditionally, in most parts of the world, building on these two biological sexes, most societies created structures which put men considerably in a considerably better position than women. So women are saying you're discriminating against us because we are disadvantaged to men. Now, the next important thing about this convention was that it's an asymmetric convention. I said before, human rights is for all humans. You have them because you're a human, a member of the human species. Well, here they said men and women are in somewhat different positions. And the rights holders for these new rights in this convention are going to be women of all ages. So in fact, it covers women and girls, even though it's not in the title, okay? So all women humans shouldn't be discriminated against compared to male humans. And women are the rights holders in this convention. So they went through in detail and set out all sorts of things which are necessary in human rights legislation to try and improve the circumstances of people. In this case, women compared to men. So political rights, rights to health, rights to vote, rights to take part in the political process as well as simply voting, rights within, say, the family to be treated equally to men, some rights for women around their childbearing, the necessity of childbearing. So treating that as a special circumstance for women, that they are the only people who can have children, and they need special protection and help from us all, both before the birth and also while they're breastfeeding, for example. So this is our very, very important UN convention focusing on women. And obviously, I'm not going to start going through the whole thing, but you can go and find it. I'm sure you can find it easily on any search engine you want to look at. Maybe you want to go and look at, some organizations are producing sort of like simplified texts, which can be particularly useful if you want to sort of get into it from at the beginning, rather than reading every detail in this text. Now, how is this made then? By a sort of semi-democratic process, women lobbying all the countries in the world who are the members of the United Nations. And they are the organizations which decide this text and voted on it and brought it into effect. So now it's a legal text and it covers every country in the world which has signed up to it. And that's most countries in the world. There's about 194 actually operating countries in the world. There's a few extra ones who haven't really got their act together. But most countries in the world have signed up to this convention. So your country should be on this list. Now, the big exception is the United States. The United States has never signed up to this Human Rights Convention. And in fact, they've never signed up to the one on children's rights either. And so for people beaming in from America, that causes all sorts of complications about this. But it's true. Your government has none of your governments have ever decided to put an American signature on this document. Okay? The one also sort of notable exception on it is that at this stage in the 1970s, it didn't include any specific text about violence against women, which, is interesting in the terms of the history of, the improvements in women's rights and lives. No, this isn't specifically acknowledged. But what's happened since then is that there are various UN bodies of experts who are supposed to supervise this convention and go round on a sort of rota every 4 or 5 years, asking countries who've signed up to report to them on how they're getting on with implementing and improving the situation for women in their countries under this convention. So what happens is there's a time schedule, and the UN committees of experts start to look into the situation, but also they will accept reports from NGOs or women's organizations or anyone in particular, who wants to say, I want to tell these UN experts what's going on in my country in practice, and obviously to point out deficiencies and problems. And the UN will then listen to that. They will also have a report from the country itself, which will be saying, of course, we're doing lots and lots of things, we're really good. And then they issue a final report. The UN experts issue a report, and they will be giving you a reasonably good run over of how things are going in that country and pointing out problems and urging the country to do better. They don't have any power to force the country to do better, but the fact that this is all public and other people can read it obviously has some impact, because the country is being criticised in public by an organisation which is supposed to be global and independent. Okay? So some of you from different countries will have been involved in putting in what they call these shadow reports to this UN committee that looks after this convention. It's the same system for other human rights conventions as well. So that is where we are at the moment. And apart from a lot of reports from the UN and pressure by women and then at the UN to actually take violence against women seriously, there haven't been any changes to the text of this convention since 1980. Now, one issue comes up, which is that the trans cult is very, very keen to somehow include men in this convention. And lawyers, committees, political actors have been talking about this for some time. And I look at some of their stuff. Now, what they would love to do is somehow say that men who call themselves women should suddenly become women under this convention. It's for eliminating discrimination against women, but somehow mysteriously the word women in this convention includes them, even though there's nothing in this convention about, along those lines at all. Well, that's not going to work, because a fundamental rule of law is that you make laws with clearly understood words that everybody can understand, and thus you can operate a law. If you make a law for the protection of chickens that live in big battery cages, you can't come along one day and suddenly say, we've just decided that the word chicken covers rabbits. So therefore, rabbits who are living in cages in this country have to say, get counted in under this piece of legislation. You have to specifically change it. And that would mean going back to the countries which control this convention. They would have to change the text, and they would have to vote on it as well. And it's very difficult getting all these different countries in the world to be binding votes on these things. So that is at the moment absolutely stalled. And when you read, cult documents and proposals, they admit that themselves. This is not a sensible thing to do. There is also another basic rule that normally you're not taking rights away from people. If you remember, this was done when Turkey came out of the Istanbul Convention on violence against women, and this caused, a huge amount of distress and shock. But it was because it was unusual. So, by their own weird logic, they have to point out that if you say, well, any man who calls himself a woman should be included as a woman under CEDAW, the logic would be that any woman who's calling herself a man would be excluded from CEDAW. So those women would cease to have the protection of women given to them under this convention. And that is a little bit of a difficulty, isn't it? Because it follows their own logic. You can somehow change sex by just what you say, but if a man is allowed to change sex to say, I'm a woman, and we'll treat CEDAW like that, well, that means any woman who said she's a man bounced out. She no longer has these protections. But they keep on chewing away at this. And as we know, there are certain bodies within the UN that are captured, and certain bodies in the UN who are spending a lot of time and effort on this and producing reports about pushing the trans cause. There's also many bodies, but one important one is called ILGA, International Lesbian and Gay Association, for the 4 letters in the acronym. In fact, they have a much longer name, and they are completely trans captured. They have an awful lot of money, and they're also very active at the UN. So you often get their people producing reports, popping up, and appearing at conferences and things like that. Well, my final point is, because I am keeping it short, is that I've just done a big read through a lot of the things that have been written over the last 5 years, sometimes by UN bodies themselves, sometimes at academic conferences, let's say academic conferences, sometimes by, other organizations that are interested in this field. And, well, when I stopped laughing over most of it, quite honestly, I think they're not really making any progress, because their situation is so illogical. You get people turning up at conferences and being allowed to speak, and they'll be saying things like, well, of course, it was the evil Western colonizers who told everybody that there were men and women, and before that cultures didn't agree that there were men and women. It's a Western colonial cultural imposition. But then, like a page on, they are detailing and saying we desperately need help to stop, say in our country, the traditional cultural, patriarchal and religious ideas which mean that women are badly treated, and particularly the one I've just been looking at, lesbians are particularly badly treated. So you've just gone from saying that we didn't know any about this before because it was imposed by the Westerners to saying, well, we have long-standing, terrible, indigenous religions and culture in our country, which had imposed all this anyway, and we need help to fight against it. Most strange. So it's all very, very illogical. And if you start reading through it, it's comical. But just finally, then, if you're looking at any of this, two things I've learned. First of all, is that we must fight against the odd words they're using. They are causing us a lot of problems. But it's interesting to see that particularly lawyers and a lot of UN organizations, they haven't moved on, and they haven't got any real arguments. So they just throw these strange words at you. So they're always using the word intersex, and intersex doesn't exist. But they're using that to challenge this sex binary, men and women. They use this word trans, but they never define it, and trans doesn't exist, But they say, well, because trans, well, explain to us what trans means then, and maybe we could try and understand what your argument is. They use all the other words, transgender, transsexual, cross-dresser, all sorts of different words. But also, even when they're all sitting around chatting to one another and sort of being in agreement, they can't decide on the alphabet soup of letters they're actually going to use either. So one speaker uses LGBI, and then another one uses LGBTI plus XX and everything like this. So again, you can very quickly unpick holes in all of this, because you can say, well, that speaker said one thing and the next speaker said something else. And even some speakers say two things in the same presentation. So what are they actually talking about? So we need to continually fight back against these words. And I think the lawyers are particularly vulnerable because they are just spouting out these words in place of serious legal argument. And as soon as you say, well, intersex doesn't exist, so what are you talking about? But then the final thing with dealing with them, and I've lost my train of thought a little bit about it. What was the final thing I was going to say? Give me a moment. Okay, well, we need to keep on putting in our shadow reports. We need to keep on engaging with the UN from our countries. So we need to keep on keeping it real, okay? And taking these opportunities to set out how things actually are in our countries, and the problems that we see with what you'd call standard human rights for women. And forget about all this other nonsense. UN, you work for us, hopefully. You should be concerned about women's access to political power, their access to finance, their access to decent health, giving them better laws, more money, organizing the justice system better, helping them get away from violence and abuse. We really stop, going on and on about all this stuff that when you scratch a little, you can't even describe. So I want to say to people, do not give up on the UN, and do not give up on these sort of semi-public organizations which are looking at human rights. Spend our time constantly reminding them that there are all these basic human rights, and women, they should be working actively on giving women their proper share of them. So that's what I wanted to say.
We're moving on now to our next speaker, and we're going to listen from Anne Kalvig from Norway. She will tell us about, as I said before, gender faith in Norway, the world's most equal country. Because Anne, she's a former professor of religious studies, and she has been an activist in the women's movement for over 30 years, as well as politically active on the far left. But she had to resign for her university position in protest last year after years of smear campaigns against her due to her belief that sex is binary, immutable, and that women have sex-based rights, as Sue, we're going back in a circle to the beginning, Sue was explaining to us at the beginning with the CEDAW convention. Anne is 51 years old, she's married, and she's the mother of 5. So congratulations for all those highlights and milestones. And over to you, Anne.
I realized when I heard the description of my talk being read out that it was quite a mouthful that I said I would cover. I'm not sure if I can do it all, but I will try to speak rather freely about the situation in Norway and about the situation that I have experienced as an academic that had to leave her work. And I also would like to present a book I published last year. Yeah, I guess maybe it's, is it in reverse now? You cannot, yeah, to me it is like in a mirror, but the book is called Kjønnstro, Kampen om Røynda, which translates into English as gender faith, the fight or the struggle or the fight on reality, something like that. However, the thing is that in the Norwegian language, we do not separate sex and gender in language. We have only one word, kjønn, which is actually good because then you do not fall for the what has now happened largely in the UN, but also in very many different sectors of society, that we kind of reify or we make as a phenomenon of its own and with a reality as material as sex, the concept of gender. And this was, of course, what Sue was talking about as well. And in Norwegian, when we do not have those two separate words for the notion of sex, gender, what we do when we speak about the social and cultural constructs surrounding sex, we do so by adding words and making the words like into combinations. So we speak of sex roles and sex ideals, sex stereotypes. So what happened in my workplace was, as mentioned, that there were years of smear campaigns because I had been speaking publicly and writing publicly about the problematic legal and political situation in Norway following our erasure of sex in legislation. Because this is the fact, in Norway, we have since 2016 the world's most extreme legislation on sex, gender, in terms of gender being a completely self-declared characteristic. So even a child as young as 6 years old can, by declaration, change legal sex. Of course, to people in a different situation or a different epoch, this would sound like utter nonsense, utter craziness, and of course it is. But in the climate that we have, it is the fact, the status quo in Norway. What also happens is that, what do you call it in English, the children protection, those who I should have looked up that word before going on. Maybe somebody can tell me in the chat. But you know what I mean, when the state goes in and takes over custody for children that are in need of help. Yeah. So what happens in Norway is that they go in and they take children from parents if the parents do not oblige or confirm to their identification as gender, due to, of course, this legislation, and due to the fact that we have an extremely conformist political situation. Norway is a very small country. Political networks are tight. The press groups, the lobbyists are wealthy, and they have been very successful in their campaigning. Actually, the CEDAW report, which is called Adults Only, and it was published in 2018, I think, highlights Norway as one of the countries where they, with CEDAW, that is a umbrella organization for LGBT plus youth organizations, and what they managed was to convince youth politicians through the youth organization of Norway's main gender ideology organization called FRI. Their youth organization, Skeiv Ungdom, managed to establish very tight connections to youth politicians, and they managed by also avoiding public attention, which is, it is written out in this report. It's all of this is like hidden in plain sight. They tell exactly what they have been doing, what their strategy has been, and how it has been successful. And yeah, what they managed to do in Norway was to change gender legislation fundamentally without the public even knowing. And the women's movement was not invited into the hearings or into the political process at all. So we did get, as I said, the most extreme legislation in 2016. However, in 2013, Norway introduced the empty concept of gender identity as a characteristic with that was to be into discrimination, anti-discrimination law, meaning that it was actually in 2013 that Norway decided that sex doesn't exist, because of course a consequence of saying that gender is something that you feel, something that you choose, something that you declare, and that this is separate from any diagnosis. It is a declaration model. This is effectively, of course, erasing sex as a meaningful concept. All of this, I'm sure a lot of you already know, but perhaps not too many know that this has been such a success in Norway, and also has been broadcasted to the global audience as a success, as something that we do not have arguments about, that all are in favor of this situation, which is of course not true. It is a horrible situation, and we see the consequences of it day by day. And what we see is exactly what the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Children, Women and Girls, Rem Al-Salem, what she has been warning against, namely how women in the global north have been and are victims of smear campaigns and are silenced in the public for speaking out against this utter madness. So this is the situation in Norway. If you do speak out against this ideology and this legal, political, and social and cultural situation, you are deemed a hateful person, and also a racist, transphobe, and right-wing extremist. And this was the reason why I had to leave work at last, because I was sort of accustomed to, so to speak, the social media and also the written media situation where women like me were characterized in these ways. But then you could say that, okay, these are opinions that are published, and one can, to a certain degree, argue against these opinions. However, when the fact, so to say, that women who know what a woman is and who know that sex is binary and immutable, when this is presented, when it is presented as a fact that we are right-wing extremists in research and as a documented fact in published research, then it is a much tougher issue. And this was what was done in Norway, in my university. A professor, a colleague, published an article stating that VRI Norway and other Twitter accounts that she had been supervising for a whole year. She claims in this article that we are right-wing extremists, that we are a threat to fundamental human rights and to democracy itself. And so it was very difficult for me to continue at that workplace when this was just like the the top of a pile of similar smear campaigns in various media and social media. I did complain against these false accusations, but my university, they declined to give my complaint a full treatment or to look thoroughly into what our complaint was about. So it was kind of concluded even more strongly that the women that were characterized like this in this specific paper by this professor, that this was true and ethical academic work. So this is the situation of female academics in Norway who do not go with the flow. And to me, it is such a sign of great, what is it called? Deterioration. You know, when institutions have started to crumble, actually. What you can hear is that what the trans activists are posing against us, that we are the threats and that the democracy is at stake, etc. Well, this is exactly what we do experience, but it is kind of completely incompatible worldviews. And now I will go on to talk about the book, I guess, because this is fundamentally about worldviews and whether you could have an objective outlook on life and existence, at the same time as you say that a subjective outlook and conception of what is real is as real as the objective reality at the same time and in the same relation. Now, of course, this is a total breach with everything that we know from basic formal logic, but this is an extremely illogic and irrational movement, as I'm sure you are all aware. But this is why I had the subtitle of the book as being, I didn't really think about how to translate that subtitle, but that it is a fundamental fight around how basic reality, what is basic reality, is what I tried to convey in that title. Now, assault on reality, I see in the chat. So what I did, I did have a contract with a normal publisher, but as time went by and I gave them my manuscript, I noticed that they were more and more reluctant. And finally, I asked them, do you really want to publish this book? You must tell me straight, because I cannot wait. I am in a hurry. This is urgent matter. It must be published this fall. It should have been published years ago, you know, but so I would not wait, whereas the publisher kind of, I think, wanted to wait to publish it until maybe the tides have turned and the public opinion would be more receptive, so that this would not be controversial. But I knew, and I know, that we will not be there for years to come, because the trans activists and the gender identity ideology has managed to influence all of Norwegian society, and I fear perhaps more profoundly than in any other country. So I said I will terminate the contract, and they agreed. I guess they were actually relieved. And I tried to send the manuscript to a whole lot of other publishers, but nobody wanted it. And so I ended up, I had to publish it myself. And I guess this is also a well-known situation for many women and female writers. So I made my own publishing company, or publisher, called Medvit Forlag, which translates consciousness publishing or something like that. And then what has happened in the media is that it has received a rather mixed had a rather mixed reception, but mostly positive. One very fierce text telling that I should not be listened to and I was not to be trusted. But the overall impression is that the media has not wanted to talk about this book. And when I say that, this is also, of course, very familiar to any author, I guess, that you do not get the attention around your book that you would like to have. But the special situation surrounding this book is that it was kind of a national news story that I had to leave my professor position. So this was kind of a narrative that went along with the book, and as it was said, I have been a political activist and a quite outspoken academic and a women's campaigner for 30 years. So I wouldn't say that I was a celebrity, but my name was known, and my take in this gender identity ideology issue was well known. And it was also a well-known fact that Norway has this extreme legislation, and that this is a very controversial issue. Mostly in Norwegian media and Norwegian public, one does not want to discuss the case itself. Is it possible to have subjective reality as orienting us in the same time as we orient us around objective reality? So there, it would be natural to assume that the book would be highly debated. But it has not been, because one does not want to debate this, because if you start to debate the concept of gender identity, you will lose, because it is an empty concept. It is a circular definition. It is a feeling pointing to a feeling. So it uses, for the start of the definition, what it is supposed to define. So circular definitions, normally we do not use them as the means to produce new laws, as the means to produce new ways of medically treating vulnerable people. But this is what we do in Norway and elsewhere in the world now. And in those cases that one does give gender identity some kind of content, it is, of course, by pointing to gender stereotypes, because there is nothing else to relate it to. And then it's quite obvious a reactionist concept. So anyway, this is too hard for people to handle, it seems. It's more, for the time being, it's more convenient to kind of swallow the pill that the trans activists have been given the whole world, that this has anything to do with sexual orientation and the liberation of or the right to love person of both sexes. Of course, it is the negation of sexual orientation. But this is, one does not want to discuss it. But what I did in this book, I start out by sketching out the current situation, and then I write about language, of course, because language is extremely important, and it is even more important in a movement that believes that words and language is more real than material reality. And then I have the chapters describing and analyzing what is happening in the legal field. And there, as Sue explained to us, I also use the UN Convention on Women, and I also look at the recommendations and how the later recommendations as to how to interpret the convention are presenting a false narrative that suddenly men are part of this convention. But I also then show in that chapter how utterly undemocratic the process has been when getting the laws rewritten. Which they are in Norway, and in a very, very high speed, at a high speed, and more and more laws as a consequence of the law, actually of the law from 2013, when gender identity was a what do you say, concept worthy of anti-discriminatory protection. And then I have a chapter on treatment, the medical side of it, which is also very, very tough reading, because of course I am not a legal expert, I'm not a medical expert. My expertise is in religion, but what I do is I analyze the texts that have been written and that are communicated about these fields. And I mean, as grown-ups, we are able to read and decipher texts. And so I look at what are these texts actually saying? What worldview are they conveying? And so this could be called like more methodologically a discursive take, but yeah. And then continuing from the legal field, the medical field, I go to, let me have a look, who have been the prominent actors and network in Norway, and how has academia contributed and even fueled what we are experiencing now. And then chapter 6, I look at how media has completely failed their mission, or their what is their duty, namely to see when abuse of power is going on, because they have been more or less trans activists altogether. And the way they have treated prominent feminists in Norway, like Tonje Gjevjon and Christina Ellingsen, which you know from VDI, is also analyzed here. And then finally, I have this last and the longest chapter, which is about religion. And because this is kind of maybe more what new I could bring to the table as a religious scholar. And I do show that these concepts and world views and views of what a human is are profoundly religious or spiritual, metaphysical, and that is actually okay. It's okay to have a religious worldview. We have the freedom of belief, freedom of speech, of thought. But what I discuss and criticize, of course, is that it is not recognized as religious postulates. It has been turned on the head and figures in all fabric of society and our culture as objective reality. And so this is also what I try to suggest as a way out of this mess. And here, Christina Ellingsen has been a most valuable colleague to discuss with, and I think she was maybe, well, one of the first to sort of identify and discuss the subjective faith concept of gender identity belief. And so I suggest that this is how we can move on from here, allowing men who would like to believe that they are women, allowing them to believe it, but they cannot command any other person to believe it, and they cannot let this infringe on other people's freedom of thought and freedom of religion and belief and speech, etc. But of course, this is not the situation. We have yeah, and so this in this chapter, since I was particularly a scholar of new religions, New Age, it has been interesting to see how much of this worldview and view of human life is kind of New Agey when thinking of this subjective turn. But in contrast to the New Agers or these spiritual people, they never claimed that their worldview should rewrite the laws and should punish other people and should be predicative of the procedures for altering the body, etc. Also in this, I will now finish, I see my time is up. In this chapter on religion, I do give a lot of space to porn and prostitution and surrogacy and body modification practices around the world. I do counter the belief that in other cultures they consider gender, sex gender to be extremely variegated. It has to do with sex gender roles, and for men in particular. So it's in itself, it is quite a wide field to cover. So what I can conclude by saying, maybe not very uplifting for you, but kind of uplifting for me, or I see that we must just think new and in fresh ways. Those who have been welcoming my book are the Christians. So the Christians do enjoy my message, and they do not do it because it is like, in accordance with the Bible, because I do not write from a Christian point of view. They know that. But what they do say, and that I believe, is that they want rationality and scientific agenda back into school and Norwegian legal system, etc. Of course, there are, from a women's rights point of view, there are obstacles and problems with with certain Christian groups, of course. But it is extremely interesting, and to see that those who you thought would embrace a critique that puts up material reality and power analysis, etc., that they would embrace it. That is the left, the women's movement, academia. They don't, not in Norway. They abhor people like me, and those who want to speak to me, and those with similar views like I have, are religious people. So there you go, and it's quite a chaotic situation, and the world is a mess, and Norway is a mess, and what we do see is that women's rights and that what women have gained in rights is so easily taken away when other claims are being made, and this is exactly what is happening.